Again, for me, in order to understand this book and why you wrote this book, a little bit more about you. You fought the system. You fought the Republican establishment to get the nomination for the United States Senate. Explain how that happened.
Back in 2009, I started thinking a lot about what was happening in Washington. It bothered me. It bothered me that there were a lot of people, including people within my own political party and the Republican Party, who were serving, who were not remembering the Constitution, not remembering the fact that the federal government's supposed to be one with powers that are few and defined, and those reserved to the states, numerous and indefinite. About that same time, I happened to stumble across a book, you may have heard of it, called Liberty and Tyranny. And I stumbled across it one day. I had just gotten a Kindle. There were no tablets back then, but I had a brand new Kindle. And I was looking for something to download on my Kindle. And it may be that the first book I ever bought electronically was Liberty and Tyranny.
Really?
And I stumbled across it. I thought, this looks interesting. I'll take a look at it. I couldn't put it down. I had never found something that so closely aligned with my political ideology and at the same time taught me so much. I ended up giving a lot of speeches in which I invoked a lot of themes brought up in that book. And those speeches ended up turning into a U.S. Senate campaign. I ended up running against a three-term incumbent for my own party.
Robert Bennett.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I won.
And you had a convention process in Utah.
Yes, we have a caucus and convention process preceding a primary. It's a complicated process. It works well for us.
And how old were you?
I was 39 when I was elected to the Senate. So when I first got here to Washington, I was the youngest member of the Senate.
So you went from no political office to the United States Senate. You truly are a citizen senator.
Yes. I had never held political office previously. I had never run for political office previously. And so I got into this because of my love for the Constitution. That's something that we discussed around the dinner table when I was a kid. It's something I've focused on as an attorney my entire career. And I didn't expect to run for the United States Senate at that stage of life, if ever. But the opportunity came along, and I did it, prompted in part by Liberty and Tyranny.
Well, you're
so
very
thank
kind.
you.
And then he met me and he said, oh. Anyway, so let me ask you this. Again, just so everybody knows. Your father was Rex Lee. He was Ronald Reagan's choice to be Solicitor of the United States at the Justice Department. Tell us a little about your father.
My dad served as Ronald Reagan's first Solicitor General, and the job of the Solicitor General, of course, is to represent the U.S. government in front of the Supreme Court. The Solicitor General wears a ceremonial uniform, so to speak, called a morning suit with long tails and pinstripe pants. I used to be kind of embarrassed of his suit when I went to the court with him, but I started going to the court with him when I was about 10 years old, mostly because it was a good excuse to miss school. But as I continued to attend argument sessions with him at the court, I was intrigued by government. I started to understand little by little what was happening, and it caused me to be fascinated in our constitutional system. My dad was a good man. He was a strong believer in the Constitution. He taught us about federalism from the time we learned how to talk, and taught us that it is absolutely essential to our liberty and to a system of public accountability to allow people to have local self-government.
Separation of powers and federalism. To me, there are other strengths in the Constitution, but to me, those are the key principles. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. If there's one thing my father taught me from a young age, it's that there are these two structural protections that themselves are probably more important than any other single feature of the Constitution. He said that one operates on the vertical axis, that is federalism, and the other operates on the horizontal axis, that is separation of powers. And then when you put those two together, that provides a greater bulwark against tyranny and a greater support for liberty than just about anything else we could conceive of. And that to the extent we've had problems in our system of government, it has been the result of a deviation from federalism and separation of powers.
And how healthy are those two principles right now?
They've been weakened badly over the last 80 years. In fact, we've gone to the point now, Madison described the federal government as one with powers that are few and defined, and those reserved to the states, numerous and indefinite. We've flipped that principle on its head. You can almost not find areas that the federal government doesn't currently touch. And then with separation of powers, we've got one branch that makes the laws, another that interprets them, another that enforces them. Well, the branch that's enforcing them, the executive branch, is now also making most of the law. Not just because they went on a wild hair and decided to do that, there's some of that too, but because members of Congress have voluntarily relinquished that power to the executive branch, deliberately passing the buck and the political accountability that goes with it onto unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats.
And it's not a fair question, but I'll ask it anyway. Maybe complicated. So how do we fix this? Is it fixable?
It is fixable. I'm convinced that it is. Look, I believe in something that Winston Churchill said: the American people can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other alternative. It's why I wrote this book, because I believe it can be fixed. I wrote Written Out of History because I think if people understand the historical context of the Constitution, including the stories of some of these forgotten founders whose stories I tell in here, they'll be able to inject things like federalism and separation of powers back into our national political dialogue. The problem we have with it right now is that too few people are even familiar with these concepts, or they're scared away perhaps by the names themselves. Federalism and separation of powers, the words to some might sound intimidating. But when they learn the stories behind them, when they understand that federalism came to us in part because of Canasatego, the Iroquois chief who taught this principle of federalism to Benjamin Franklin, who in turn worked that principle into the Articles of Confederation and later the Constitution.
Well, let's talk about that. Tell us about this individual.
Okay, so when we think of our system of government, we think of it as being the natural outgrowth of a European system, of the English parliamentary system with some modifications. In some respects, that's true. When we think of the political philosophers who influenced it as being people like Charles de Montesquieu and John Locke, and there's some truth to that too. But really, we ought to give more credit to Canasatego and other Native Americans. Canasatego was
I never heard of him before.
Most people haven't. Yeah. He was an Iroquois Indian chief who got to know Benjamin Franklin back in the 1740s. And they developed this long-time friendship. And Benjamin Franklin came to understand of how the Iroquois nations had come together. These 6 nations had come together, and they understood that just as, you take an arrow, it's easy to break one by itself. You bind 6 of them together, it's much harder to break. They decided that they were going to govern themselves as a nation for certain limited purposes, especially for their own defense against other tribes who would want to go to war with them. But they distinctly left local autonomy up to each tribe. That was essential to the many centuries long existence and peace and prosperity that the Iroquois nation earned.
Mm-hmm. And how long did they keep up this association?
They kept up the association through the end of Canasatego's life. And even more importantly, this knowledge of the Iroquois Confederacy and how it worked remained with Benjamin Franklin throughout the rest of his life. He tried for many decades to communicate this message. Ultimately, after the Revolution, he was able to work it into the Articles of Confederation.
And this unique relationship, Franklin and Canasatego? Canasatego. Did Franklin ever share it with the other framers or the other founders?
Oh, yes, yes. He talked about it. He talked about the Iroquois and how he had gotten to know Canasatego and how their system of government worked. So sometimes we think of our modern system of federalism as being based on the Swiss cantons. In some ways it was, but in other ways it was also based on the Iroquois. And having multiple examples to draw from really helped in terms of setting up this system of federalism. This was relatively unique at the time. This is a relatively American innovation. And like so many other things that are uniquely American, it has its roots in Native Americans who were here long before European settlers arrived.